Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. Okay, so a lot happened recently on the world stage. President Trump held these really pivotal meetings, first with Ukrainian President Zelensky and European leaders, and then, crucially, a call with Russian President Putin.
Right, all focused on the war in Ukraine, which has been dragging on now for, what, 3.5 years?
Exactly. And the goal seems to be halting the conflict. But what's particularly interesting is how Trump's approach seems to be shifting. Initially, it was about getting a quick ceasefire.
Yeah, that was the early talk.
But then, after speaking with Putin, he seemed to align more with Moscow's idea of a, quote, long-term peace settlement. And this involves some big conditions, right? Like ruling out Ukraine joining NATO, but still offering some kind of security guarantee.
Security guarantees, but with Europe stepping up?
It's definitely more than just Ukraine, though. This feels like a major test case for this whole America First diplomatic style, especially now that people are talking about a new Cold War.
It really does.
So here's the big question we're diving into today. What if the key to unlocking these global conflicts and, securing American interests isn't endless talks, but this bolder display of strength and a really sharp focus on national interest?
A very provocative question.
So today, that's our deep dive. We're unpacking this complex diplomacy around Ukraine, but specifically through that conservative foreign policy lens. We'll look at how it's trying to redefine alliances, security, even what winning means against powers like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
It's a fundamental rethinking in many ways.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because before we get right into the Ukraine specifics, I think it's crucial we understand the foundation. What are the core principles guiding this America First approach? How does someone viewing the world through a conservative foreign policy lens actually see things?
Well, fundamentally, it often starts with the premise that the world is, well, inherently dangerous. It's not a place that can be easily perfected or remade.
Right. Less optimistic, perhaps.
Yeah, you could say that. It emphasizes loyalty to your own group, acknowledges that hierarchy is maybe more natural than we sometimes admit, and that traditions matter. So from that perspective, the main job of the U.S. government in foreign policy isn't some broad mission to make the world better.
Unlike maybe a progressive view might frame it.
Exactly. Instead, it's about advancing American interests first, period. That's the core of America First. It's about prioritizing your own nation's security and prosperity.
Okay, so it's a framework prioritizing national interests, self-preservation almost. How does that translate into actual actions, on the world stage?
It translates very directly into the idea of peace through strength. This isn't about looking for fights. It's about building a U.S. military so strong that potential adversaries think twice about starting anything.
Deterrence.
Precisely. Deterrence and the ability to respond decisively if needed. You generally won't find much enthusiasm in this view for long, drawn-out wars without very clear, achievable goals. And there's, frankly, a lot of skepticism about just reasoning with regimes like China or Russia.
So talking isn't enough.
The view is often that talk is cheap, especially with adversaries who don't share your values. You need to deal with them from a position of undeniable strength. Dialogue follows strength. It doesn't replace it.
That definitely provides a clear framework. And, looking back, this isn't entirely out of the blue for American foreign policy, is it? There are echoes here.
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating because while President Trump is often seen as, a disruptor,
For sure.
his approach actually has strong echoes of Reagan. Reagan's peace through strength, even his version of America First, that shining city on a hill idea, implied American exceptionalism. And Reagan wasn't afraid of tough tactics. Remember, he used tariffs against allies to push for what he called free and fair trade.
That's a really interesting parallel with Trump's use of tariffs.
It is. And it connects to this deep sense of national identity. You see it in the data, too. Something like 75% of Republicans agree the U.S. is the greatest country versus maybe 35% of Democrats. This isn't just, flag-waving. It informs the policy, this idea that America should act decisively, sometimes unilaterally, for its own interests.
That statistic really does underscore that foundational belief. And okay, we see these principles very clearly, I think, in the current approach to the Ukraine war. Tell us about these recent meetings we mentioned, the ones that got so much attention.
Right. Those meetings on August 18th and 19th were really telling. You had President Trump hosting President Zelensky and top European leaders in the Oval Office. And the context matters here. It was apparently a very different vibe from a meeting back in February that was described as disastrous.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing reports about that,
Yeah.
criticisms about gratitude, even Zelensky's clothes.
It's exactly. Trump and Vice President Vance apparently made comments. This time, reports noted Zelensky wore dressier clothes, and Vance was publicly silent. Then, after those talks, Trump spoke with Putin. And remember, Putin himself had received quite the welcome at a summit with Trump in Alaska just days before that.
So a definite shift in tone and optics. And you mentioned Trump's strategy itself has evolved. What's the core change there?
It's a clear pivot. The initial push was for an immediate ceasefire. Just stop the fighting. But after meeting with Putin, Trump seemed to shift, aligning more with Moscow's call for a broader, long-term peace settlement.
Okay, so moving beyond just stopping the immediate violence.
Right. And this conservative strategy has a very specific view on Ukraine's security going forward. Trump has been firm. Ukraine joining NATO is off the table.
That's a big red line for Russia, obviously.
It is. But importantly, Trump has said he supports NATO-like security guarantees. Now, for you listening, NATO-like essentially means a mutual defense pledge, like Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. But, and this is critical, the vision is for Europe to take the lead.
So European nations provide the main guarantee.
Yes, with the U.S. offering things like air support, acting in a limited backup role, explicitly no U.S. troops on the ground. French President Macron even connected these guarantees directly to Europe's overall security, which shows how significant this is for them, too.
That really does shift the burden or responsibility onto Europe. What about next steps? Is there a plan for more talks? And how did the Europeans actually react to all this?
Trump mentioned plans for Zelensky and Putin to meet bilaterally, maybe followed by a three-way summit with him involved. Interestingly, he did admit the war was, quote, far more complicated than he first thought.
A moment of candor, perhaps.
Perhaps. Though he also optimistically suggested we could know if a resolution is possible within 2 weeks. As for European reactions, it was largely a show of unity, lots of praise for Trump, even with past friction over things like tariffs. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte called him Dear Donald and amazing.
Wow.
Though German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was maybe a bit more cautious, saying the path is open, but, again, more complicated. So, public unity, but maybe some underlying questions about the details.
Understandable, because those details matter immensely when you look at what Russia and Ukraine actually want. Their demands seem worlds apart. How does this conservative approach even try to bridge that gap?
That's exactly the challenge. The demands are starkly different. Russia wants guarantees Ukraine never joins NATO, limits on Ukraine's military, no Western troops allowed in Ukraine, and crucially, for Ukraine to surrender the Donbas region where Russia already controls almost 90%.
So basically formalizing their control and neutralizing Ukraine.
Pretty much. And Putin has also rejected the idea of NATO peacekeepers. Ukraine, meanwhile, wants an immediate ceasefire, yes, but absolutely insists on keeping all its territory, including Crimea.
Which they see as constitutionally theirs.
Correct. They argue ceding land is unconstitutional and would just set Russia up for another attack later. Plus, Zelensky continues to insist on more Western military aid. So, yeah, poles apart.
Okay, so given those opposing positions, how could this realistically play out? Are there scenarios being discussed?
Yes, the Al-Habtoor Research Center laid out 3 potential scenarios. And looking at these through that conservative lens is interesting because it highlights which outcomes might be prioritized. Scenario 1, seen as the most probable, is a comprehensive political settlement, but one that's largely advantageous to Russia.
Meaning Ukraine gives up a lot.
Yes. Significant territorial concessions, likely formalizing Russian control in the Donbas, Ukraine accepting neutral status, no NATO, sanctions on Russia might gradually lift. The U.S. would offer those Article 5-like guarantees, but again, Europe leads. The downside here, even from some conservative viewpoints valuing order, is that this could be seen as rewarding aggression.
Right. It potentially undermines international norms about territory. What's the second scenario?
Scenario 2, also rated highly probable simply because the gaps are so wide, is the collapse of peace talks. Negotiations fail. This likely leads to a prolonged conflict, but maybe at a lower intensity because both sides are running low on resources.
A sort of grinding stalemate.
Kinda. You'd still see clashes, maybe targeted assassinations. The Zaporizhia nuclear plant remains a huge worry. And crucially, in this scenario, U.S. support for Ukraine would likely be limited under an America First approach.
Yeah.
Probably not enough for Ukraine to launch major counteroffensives. Disengagement might be prioritized if the conflict isn't seen as directly serving core U.S. interests anymore.
Okay, so a frozen or simmering conflict. is there a third option?
The third scenario, considered the most favorable for Ukraine right now, is a ceasefire that essentially freezes the current front lines. This would stop the major Russian attacks, let Ukraine dig in, maybe get more ammo. But Russia would keep de facto control over roughly 20% of Ukraine, including Crimea, just without formal recognition. Sanctions on Russia would likely stay.
So a pause, but not a resolution.
Exactly. It's pragmatic, stops the bleeding for Ukraine in the short term, but it leaves a dangerous, frozen conflict that could easily flare up again. For a conservative calculus, though, it might be seen as an acceptable, if imperfect, outcome that limits further U.S. entanglement and cost.
Each of those has huge implications. And this really feeds into that broader idea many conservatives are talking about now, this new Cold War. What does that actually mean in this context? How does it reshape America's role?
Yeah, connecting the dots is key here. This new Cold War framing sees the primary strategic challenge, not as, say, terrorism was after 9/11, but as a long-term confrontation, mainly with the Chinese Communist Party. Russia, Iran, North Korea are seen as part of this challenge too, sometimes called a new axis of evil.
Not a formal alliance, but aligned adversaries.
Exactly, working together implicitly or explicitly, making the threat greater. And the goal, echoing Reagan against the Soviets, is framed very simply. We win, they lose.
What does winning look like there?
It means adversaries either abandon their hostile goals or are basically rendered incapable of pursuing them. It's seen as an ideological struggle, too, the free world versus these hostile, totalitarian regimes.
So if that's the overarching goal, how does it change specific security priorities?
It changes them fundamentally. From this perspective, the number one existential threat is China. It's not climate change, which might be seen as, a problem to manage, but not the top national security priority demanding all resources. So logically, that leads to calls for dramatically increased U.S. defense spending. We're talking potentially doubling it from around 3%, maybe up to 6% of GDP. Revitalizing the defense industrial base becomes paramount. This is the peace through strength doctrine in action for this new era.
And you see the contrast with allies there too, right?
Absolutely. Currently, only 18 out of 32 NATO members even hit the 2% defense spending target. This worldview says that's not sustainable, especially in a new Cold War. And other things tie in too. Border security becomes a major Cold War issue. An open border seems illogical when you see huge increases in encounters with military-age individuals from rival nations, like the 24,000 military-age Chinese citizens encountered last year, up from just 450 in 2021. That raises alarms.
That's a striking number.
And energy policy gets linked directly to national strength. Restrictions on domestic energy are seen as weakening America strategically. Energy independence is vital.
So military strength, border security, energy independence, all interconnected parts of the strategy. What about traditional alliances? How do they fit in, or how are they changed?
Alliances are still valued, but the terms change. The big emphasis is on burden sharing. Allies must step up, increase their defense spending significantly. Some suggest NATO members really need 3% of GDP now, not just 2%, to meet the new challenges.
More demands on allies.
Yes, and a willingness to renegotiate relationships. Using tools like tariffs isn't just about trade. It's leverage to get allies to contribute more fairly to collective defense.
Yeah.
And as we saw with Ukraine, the expectation is clear. Europe needs to take primary responsibility for its own neighborhood security, with the U.S. playing a supporting, not leading, role. Alliances become more transactional, based on clear mutual benefit and shared effort.
It's really fascinating. This isn't just tweaking foreign policy. It feels like a fundamental rethink of America's entire place in the world. But this approach, this kind of bold, sometimes seemingly improvised diplomacy, it must attract criticism too, even from people who might share the overall conservative goals.
Oh, definitely. That's a really important point. Even within conservative foreign policy circles, you hear concerns. Some argue that President Frank's peacemaking efforts, particularly, can seem ad hoc or improvised.
Lacking a clear, established process.
Right, lacking the kind of proven frameworks used in past successful mediations. And the concern for some strategists isn't just about messy process. It's that improvisation could unintentionally signal weakness or inconsistency, the very opposite of what peace through strength intends. They might argue that real strength is shown through predictable, steady diplomacy backed by power.
That's a really interesting tension, decisiveness versus consistency. What other criticisms pop up within this discussion?
Another big one is the potential erosion of international norms. If a peace deal forces Ukraine to give up territory, does that undermine the principle of territorial integrity everywhere? Could it embolden other powers like China or Iran? This creates a real dilemma because conservatives traditionally do value a stable, predictable international order.
So a potential conflict between pragmatism and principle there.
Exactly. And then there's the credibility of security guarantees. History looms large here, specifically the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons for security assurances that ultimately proved empty.
Because they lacked enforcement.
Precisely. So any new guarantees need real teeth. Trump ruling out U.S. troops to enforce a deal raises questions about how credible those guarantees would actually be. Words on paper aren't enough if adversaries don't believe they'll be backed up.
That makes sense. History suggests guarantees need enforcement. And what about just trusting Russia's intentions in these talks?
Well, there's widespread skepticism there. Many analysts, across the spectrum really, suspect Russia might just be using talks to stall, regroup, and secure a better position later. Even Trump himself apparently admitted Putin's attitude towards talks had been meaningless at times.
So deep cynicism about the process itself.
Yes. And finally, it's worth remembering there isn't total agreement, even among Republicans or conservatives. You had some maybe more traditional Reaganites who initially argued for going all in to help Ukraine win decisively. But as the war dragged on, others shifted, seeing a negotiated settlement, even an imperfect one, as more realistic, especially if it frees up resources to focus on the bigger perceived threat, China.
So it's definitely a complex debate, even viewed through this specific conservative lens.
Absolutely.
What a complex picture indeed. Today, we've really taken a deep dive into how this conservative America-first foreign policy thinking in terms of peace through strength, defining winning in a new Cold War, is actively shaping the approach to the Ukraine conflict. It's all about securing national interests, yes, but also fundamentally reevaluating alliances and how to deal with adversaries.
A major shift in perspective and practice.
So as the world keeps grappling with these shifting power dynamics, these persistent conflicts, maybe the question for you, the listener, to really ponder is this: does this bold national interest first strategy offer a clearer, more effective path to global stability? Or does its unconventional, sometimes unpredictable nature actually introduce new and perhaps even greater risks onto the world stage?